Now, I got a question.
Okay, wait, hold on. Here we go. Charles Moscowitz, thanks for joining me, everyone. James Perloff is with me. It's an honor to be joined by you, James. I've been following you for many, many years. As you know, you're the author of many books that have had a big influence on me. Um, and among them, of course, is your classic, The Shadows of Power,
Mm.
about the Council on Foreign Relations, your book, Tornado in a Junkyard, and more recently, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. But today we're talking about your book, COVID-19 the agendas to come, red pilled. Let me just hold that up briefly so that there we go. Yep, and thank you for sending it to me, James. Um, the you and I both tend to have a view of politics and culture from an analysis of conspiracy, and we look at the situation in that context. I mean, I can't but believe that there's a lot of evidence that there's something really rotten about the way this country and this world has responded to this virus, which is a
Mhm.
real disease, but nevertheless, the response has a very political element to it. So
Right.
let's start out with just an overview, beginning with the absolute falsities that were involved with the way this thing was launched.
Yeah. And before I answer that, I just want to ask you a quick question,
Yeah.
Charles. It says on my screen that this is live on YouTube. So are we live to an audience right now?
Yes.
Oh, we are. Okay. I just wanted to see if I thought we are just actually just being pre-recording today. I didn't realize
No,
this
no,
is
we do
actually live.
both. I mean, it's live and it goes to all of my
Mm.
podcast affiliates.
Yeah. Well, there are all kinds of indications that this was um, a political lockdown. You know, I have been a registered nurse for 45 years, though I retired from nursing last year before this so-called pandemic began. But I knew from years of experience that you don't quarantine healthy people. It would have to be a very special situation for that. And we see that this virus is not special in that regard. Um, Dr. Dolores Cahill, the eminent immunologist professor at University College of Dublin, and says that it's not air transmissible. You could cough on someone and give it to them that way, but this idea that this asymptomatic person is going to cause another person to get it is not in accord with actual fact. And also, if you look at perspective, when I was a little boy, 6 years old, I got a flu shot for the Asian flu of 1957, and that epidemic was much worse than this one. There were 1 million people who died worldwide, and including 116,000 here in the United States. That's according to the CDC's own website. Now, you got to put that in perspective, too, because the world population back then was only 2.8 million compared to 7.8 million now. So it's about 3 times more. That would be translated about 3 million deaths today. And we still haven't touched 1 million with COVID. And we have to remember, too, we'll get into this, that the numbers for COVID have been greatly inflated through tampering with death certificates and by conflating it with other diseases. So I knew from the beginning that this did not accord with our previous practices. It didn't make any sense, especially when you look at the tremendous destruction of our economy. The millions that, according to Reuters, we have 28 million people here in America who are threatened now with eviction. And we have as of May, we had 40 million people that filed for unemployment. We've got tens of thousands of small businesses closed permanently. And even the small businesses that are still open, you go to that, they're really struggling. They've got reduced staff. They have reduced customers that can permit into the store. It depends on what state you're in, the restrictions, right? But you can see just a tremendous negative impact on our society. And obviously for other agendas, which you and I have talked about going back for years, or early days of the John Birch Society, you might say,
Yeah.
going back to the 1980s. Actually for me, I like to say I got red pilled basically in 1978 when I read Gary Allen's book, Then They're Called Conspiracy, and that
Excellent.
woke me to the Federal Reserve, some of the false flags, the Council on Foreign Relations, the drive for global government. We see it all coming to fruition now. In fact, just recently, Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, called for global government as a solution to the COVID crisis. So you can see that this is actually part of a long-term agenda. It's not something new, but it did take me by surprise that they were going to use a medical pretext for it.
Well, I mean, they've certainly tried everything else. They've tried world wars. They've tried
Yeah.
depressions. right? I mean, they've tried. I think you might know about the Hudson Institute's paper that was issued in 1965, headed up by economist John Kenneth Galbraith, where they speculated on two agendas, two ideas that could lead to world government. The first was global warming, and the second was aliens invading from outer space. Now,
Is that the report from Green Mountain? Is that the one you're
yes,
talking about?
Green
I'm
Mountain.
sorry, Iron Mountain. Excuse me, Iron Mountain.
Iron. Oh,
Could call
thank
it
you.
Green Mountain. Yeah,
Thanks for
they're talking about
refreshing my
green
memory.
stuff, but yeah, the report from
The
Iron
Iron Mountain
Yeah, I
report.
know that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this is I guess they've decided to go the route of world mobilization using the fear and panic and terror of disease.
Right.
And, and yet, as you say, I mean, the idea of shutting down a society like this, it certainly fits into a political agenda, but it hasn't been done in certain societies such as Sweden and others. I think Belarus refused to do it, which is,
Right.
they say, why the president there is now being attacked. And yet they have not fared any better or worse than societies that underwent the full shutdown, I understand.
Right.
Now, some reasonable measures could be taken because it is a dangerous disease. People who are at high risk or who are elderly need to take precautions. And, there could be a moderate public policy without this really what can only be described as a medical martial law on an international level, which is where I really smell a rat. This really doesn't look right. Now, James, in your book, you talk about the possible biochemical origins or biological weaponized origins of the disease. Recently on Tucker Carlson, there was a doctor, I'm sure you might have seen this, Chinese doctor, she was from the Wuhan lab, who said just that. She said this is a weaponized disease. It did not jump from bats to people. It was, there's something about the genetic component of it, which indicates that it was tampered with and created. What do you thought? What are your thoughts about the origins of this particular virus?
Yeah, I have my book is broken into 5 sections, and the middle section is theories about the disease, and I start with the mainstream claim, which is that people were eating bat soup from this seafood market in Wuhan, and that it spread from there. Although they never, even the Chinese admitted they were never able to find patient zero. They were never really sure about that. And now it's been raised, the question has been raised whether or not that seafood market even sold bats. But then I go on to talk about the bioengineering theory. You and I are both from Massachusetts, and of course, I voted for Dr. Shiva Adulari on primary day. I used to, they got 40% of the vote. I was impressed, but he's one of those guys who's on top of this COVID situation. He has 4 degrees from MIT, including a PhD in bioengineering. He says it is a bioengineered virus. Looking at it, there are too many specific changes for this to have occurred in a lab. And there are a lot of people who support that. Luc Montagnier, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus, says there's no way this could have been created in any place but a lab. There was a paper out of India, which I've looked at, by 9 scientists, 9 scholars, who said that this could not be by chance, although that paper was withdrawn, but Montagnier was withdrawn under political pressure. In addition to that, Dr. Francis Boyle, who drafted the language for the Biochemical Weapons Convention that we signed here in the United States, he cites a number of papers from Australia, from France, pointing to that this comes from some kind of engineered method. And actually, it was Rashid Buttar, MD, who called attention, at least for me, to a paper in Nature magazine back in 2015, which was talking about the fact that at Chapel Hill, they had this biosafety weapons lab, but they're taking specimens from our own biochemical weapons at Fort Detrick, a SARS virus, and we're doing gain of function on it. In other words, they're trying to make it more lethal and more able to invade humans. And this drew a lot of criticism, and it's actually in violation of the U.S. moratorium on biochemical weapons development, but an exception was made for Chapel Hill by the NIH, which is, Dr. Fauci's organization. And then it's interesting that at the Chapel Hill biochemical weapons lab, the biosafety lab, where they were doing this research, they had researchers from China, including Dr. Xiangling Shi, who is the head of the virology department, their biochemical weapons lab, a level 4 lab in Wuhan. And some people suspect that Chinese brought this back to China. And it's interesting, Newsweek magazine came out with an article noting that Dr. Fauci had supported that work with millions of dollars of US tax dollars. And I quote that article in the book. So that's not to say that it necessarily came from Chapel Hill and Wuhan. It could have come from another country. In fact, right before the outbreak in Wuhan, there was something called the World Military Games with representatives from 110 countries, military representatives. Of course, it's the military of individual countries that usually stores the biochemical weapons. So it could have come from different places. Although I would say that that link between Chapel Hill and Wuhan seems like a likely suspect, but definitely there are a lot of scholars out there who believe that this had a bioengineering origin.
And there are also links, I think, between MIT and China, where you had this professor who was in the employ of the Communist Chinese, apparently try to smuggle something out of the country to China. There's another guy in Chicago who tried to smuggle something to China. Which brings us to, a broader question which we don't know the answer to, that it may not even be China per se. It could be some sort of a deep state operation.
Right.
I think that's, again, we want to be responsible here. We don't know.
Right.
But, given the politics of it, I would suggest that even whether it is or not, and whether it's biologically created or natural, we don't know the answer to that, but it doesn't matter. The fact is it is being used as a political football to create a complete international shutdown. And at the same time, it's being used in this country by certain governors, particularly Andrew Cuomo, most notoriously, to literally spread it to people that maybe back before World War II might have been called useless eaters. The eugenics programs of Margaret Sanger, the Negro Project. In other words, the population that are expendable, namely the nursing homes, where he went against a federal order to protect nursing homes and literally put in an order statewide to introduce active COVID-19 patients into nursing homes. And the same thing is true with Pennsylvania, Michigan, and California, which, to my way of thinking, is it has to be one of the most evil and despicable crimes of the century. I mean, it's to actually do something like that. I don't know if there'll ever be accountability for it, but you point out in your book, James, that states like New York were dealing with a major budget crunch at that time. Medicaid was at a huge deficit, and that by raising the numbers of coronavirus cases in their states, they were able to get increased federal funding for Medicaid and for other programs. So, this is maybe that was their motivation. Maybe it's something even worse than that, like population control or something more sinister. But what we do know, as a matter of fact, is that these governors did expose vulnerable populations to the disease, and that those vulnerable populations make up a large percentage of the numbers of deaths from this disease.
That's correct. Reportedly, about 70% in Pennsylvania and about 40% nationwide were from these nursing homes. And, as a registered nurse, I mostly worked in acute care hospitals. I also worked some in rehab, but I also worked sometimes in nursing homes. Our protocol in a nursing home was that our nursing homes were designed for daily care of the elderly population. They were designed to help people, with their eating, their bathing, their dressing, to have as normal a life as they could. Hopefully you threw some entertainment in there and some fun for them. But if they were sick, if they got a fever, our protocol was always if they ran a fever, you get a patient with a fever of 102, send them out to the hospital so they could be worked up. A chest X-ray, check their urine, see if they got find out what the cause of the infection is that's causing the fever, and then they'd be in the hospital for a while, getting typically IV fluids and antibiotics before they came back. And once those fevers subsided in the hospital, then they would start to send them back to the nursing home once they were, and they'd probably continue on antibiotics by mouth. The typical protocol. But they did the exact opposite of that. They took acutely ill people and sent them into the nursing homes, which I can say it depends on the nursing home, but nursing homes in general, they're just not prepared to deal with acutely ill people. They're not set up for that at all. So they don't have the gowns, the isolation equipment. Usually the rooms are not, it depends on the facility, but most nursing homes, the patients' rooms are not private. They usually have roommates. So there's just, for most of them, they're not in a position to isolate people and practice proper isolation procedures. So yeah, with a death warrant, the numbers prove it. And I quote Dr. Simone Gold, and she went on, became a whistleblower with Dr. I think it's Wohlgelertner, and they were talking about the fact that this was well known to the governors at this time, that Italy, the average age of dying there was 79.5. They knew the elderly were exposed, and yet, you know, that the naval ship Comfort came into New York, yet it remained empty, basically empty. Governor Cuomo didn't send anybody there or to the Javits Center, which was also set up for caring for these COVID patients. So yeah, sending the people into the nursing homes and letting all those people die where it spread rapidly was inexcusable.
Oh, it's the most evil thing. There are some medications that have proven effective, one of which we cannot name on YouTube, as you know.
Really? I didn't know you couldn't mention on YouTube.
You cannot mention
although I know
the
that
name.
there's a lot of things you can't say on YouTube.
We all know which one we're talking about. It's the one that President Trump used,
Right.
along with zinc and azithromycin. But if we mention the name of this particular drug, I could lose my show. So we're going to. Yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't know it was that severe just on this.
Oh no,
on the
it's
big H.
people are being
H.
taken down because they mentioned the name of this particular drug. And I don't think we need to mention it because my viewers and listeners know exactly which one we're talking about.
Okay.
The point I want to talk about that drug, however, without mentioning the name, the drug that shall be not named, right? That it's been used effectively since the 1950s. It's been, it's a generic drug. There's not a lot of money to be made by the drug companies, and that it's been proven to be a very effective and safe drug. It's no drug is perfect. Don't go out and get it unless you have a prescription. And you read the fine print, of any drug, of course. However, it's been effective, and none other than, as you point out in your book, Dr. Anthony Fauci himself noted its effectiveness back in the 1970s with regard to the to dealing with viruses. So, yet it has been virtually banned. It's very difficult for doctors to get prescriptions for it for their patients. I've talked to a number of doctors who themselves are taking it, and I think that probably quietly a lot of people who are in the front lines of this are taking it and should be taking it. But to my way of thinking, what is it about this that is causing this kind of a blackout of information? Why are they trying to stop this drug?
Dr. Fauci did know that this particular drug was effective because his own journal, the Journal of Virology from the NIH, published an article on this drug being very effective against SARS, which is 79% similar to the disease we're talking about today. So he already knew that it would work, and it's very cheap. It costs $20 or less for treatment. It looks as you could, a reasonably good guess is that Big Pharma is behind this, and people like Bill Gates, who says he is personally funding 7 vaccine factories. There's big money to be made by companies like Moderna. I don't know, those execs at Moderna are selling their stock all the time. They talk about the Moderna billionaires. These guys can vote themselves stock anytime they want and then go out and sell it. Basically, is in our capitalistic system, that's often the way it works. But I would have to say that they apparently weren't expecting this drug to come up as a roadblock to their plan for a universal vaccine, and so they had to do everything they could to suppress it.
Right. So it really comes down to a money thing, and I suppose that forms a sort of an informal collusion with political figures who want to keep this thing going as long as possible. The actual contagion itself spiked, I think, sometime toward the middle of April. Then it began to decline in May. Now it's really at a low level, and it has not increased. Even the New York Times, I suppose, to maintain a level of credibility, came out with an article a couple of weeks ago where they exposed the fact that the testing has been done in such a way that it amplifies even the slightest margin of COVID, which is normal. We all carry viruses
Right.
in the system, and then those people get listed as being positive. And but the fact of the matter is that as of today, and probably since maybe late May, the the contagion rate is less than 1%. The death rate is very, very low.
Mhm.
It's really hitting again people who had already had it or people who were in vulnerable populations, and yet they're continuing with the lockdown. What is the present condition, if you will, of this, and how can they justify this continued lockdown at this point?
They really can't. The British newspaper The Sun on September the 2nd said that the chances of dying from COVID now in Britain are 1 in 2 million. In this past week, based on statistics from the Irish government, turns out your chances of dying from COVID in Ireland are 0.002%. And Dr. Ron Paul, who we both know, a wonderful man, great congressman, former presidential candidate, and physician, he wrote a column, or actually had a show, his Liberty Report about a month ago, where he noted, and I quote him in my book, that the death rate at that time had already declined 90%. And so why weren't the media jumping for joy at the fact that fewer people are dying from COVID? So what he says is they switched from talking about death to cases, and the cases were, as you point out, based on tests. Now, Dr. Beta Stadler, who's a former head of the Immunology Institute in Bern, Switzerland, says that all the test is showing is just fragments of the DNA from the virus that the person contracted in the past. It's probably inactive. He believes that it's gone. The virus is totally gone in Switzerland, and a number of epidemiologists. The Unheard channel, I think it was almost a good 6 weeks ago, interviewed Sunetra Gupta, who is a epidemiologist at Oxford. She said she believed that the virus is definitely on the way out in Britain, and that's being backed up now by statistics. And there was another doctor in Italy who said that basically it's gone in Italy, that there's no viral load now when they test patients. So they had to go from talking about death to talking about cases. And when they talk about cases, they're really not talking about sick people or dying people. Not to say that there aren't some people who maybe are still getting sick from it, but they would be a small percentage at this point. Again, not denying that there were some people who got a severe reaction in the beginning. There were some.
Right.
I'm acquainted through people I've spoken to, doctors and even podcast hosts, who knew people who died from COVID in the early stages, but that's not the case now. There is no justification for a lockdown at all at this point. We should be opening up our economy instead of putting millions of people at risk from the death that comes from unemployment, homelessness, and all the cancer screenings and heart screenings, elective surgeries that are not being done. Dental work, was put on hold for months. So many health issues are not being attended to, while we still have this incredibly low death rate at this point. By the way, I do point out in the book that it's possible that the death rate will suddenly surge. I'm a little concerned about that because Bill Gates has been talking about, well, this is pandemic 1 and we have to get ready for pandemic 2.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and he says that in October, November, the death rates are going to surge because we're not doing enough to lock down. And he said, he's also made the statement with a slight smirk on his face. He said that will get their attention. I'm concerned that something will happen in October, November to kind of they're going to try and put egg on our face and see, we told you this was dangerous, and you guys went around saying that it wasn't. So we're not saying it wasn't dangerous in the beginning. We're saying that right now, as you and I are doing this podcast, right now the death rates are documentably low. But it doesn't mean that at some point in the future they won't release some new bioweapon or use some other method and claim that there's a surge in rates. That may happen in the future, but right now the lockdown is surely not justified.
So then it would not happen as a natural occurrence then, that there might be a second surge of
I don't think, well, based on the evidence that we've seen that from some of the scholars I mentioned before, that this is bioengineered. If there was a surge from a bioweapon, I think it'll be engineered. I'm also concerned about this 5G component. I know that a lot of people have poo-pooed it. And in my book, I have a chapter on the way I call the 5G theory. And I quote people in alt media on both sides of the argument. I quote, Corbett and Bros did an interview who said they feel that there's no relationship between 5G and
The virus.
COVID, the virus. And I also quote some scholars like Dr. Ronald Kostov of the Georgia Institute of Technology and Magda Havas, PhD, who think there is a relationship. They're responsible people that have done good research. And so I'm trying to present both sides without taking a strong bias, but I am concerned about the fact that 5G is rolled out, it seems unceasingly. You'd think it would slow down with all the economic distress we're under, but no, they're determined to get those tens of thousands of satellites up there and millions of ground transmitters. There was a video, of course, went viral when Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut interviewed representatives of the telecom industry at a Senate hearing, and he asked them, has any safety testing ever been done on 5G? And finally, with little smirks on their faces, they said, no, we're not aware of any safety testing. Well, we already know that 4G has been documented in peer-reviewed science journals as causing increased cancer rates, lowered sperm counts, DNA damage, heart irregularities, and other problems. 5G is a lot stronger, and they're going to be putting it right. It's not going to be like 2 miles away in a cell tower. It's going to be maybe right outside your home, transmitting these millimeter wave frequencies, as well as low-flying satellites. So this is something to be concerned about. And there is a book out. It's called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, where he talks about the Russian flu of 1889, the Spanish flu of 1918, the Asian flu of 57, and the Hong Kong flu of 68. And he notes that each one of these corresponded with a new electromagnetic rollout. The Russian flu in 1889 with the rollout of electricity itself, the Spanish flu with a rollout of radio, and then in the 50s, we're getting worried about Russian incoming missiles, so we built a lot of radar, and that correlated with the Asian flu, and then the launching of satellites in the late 60s with the Hong Kong flu. He believes that when you do this, it impacts the ionosphere, the electrical envelope of the Earth, and then since our bodies are to an extent electrical, this affects our health. And he is concerned that 5G could cause pandemic-like symptoms. And if his theory is right about these past pandemics, then it's a legitimate concern. By the way, I find his book to be very well researched. He's really done his homework. So
I'm going to try to. I'm going to look into that. I'll try to interview him, and also whether or not this may be the case. The fact is that it has been admitted under congressional testimony that they have not done the proper research to find out the safety of it, that it could be used as a tool to really ultimately accomplish what you and I have talked about for years. One world control. I mean, from space with electronic means. I mean, it certainly seems to fall in the realm of that, and given what we know about the orientation of people who have been conspiring to do this, I certainly would not for a second put it past them. In fact, if anything, they probably are, smacking their chops waiting for this to happen. Now, here in Boston, of course, we see that college students are being demonized for having parties and for going out, particularly at Boston College. What should we tell? What is the present condition with regard to what they say, the facts on the ground, in terms of how people should conduct themselves?
Of course, the government is saying you have to socially distance and wear masks. I do have a chapter in my book on social distancing and masks, and I quote Dr. Russell Blaylock and quite a few others. In fact, I thought this was especially significant. There was an article in one of the British newspapers, The Telegraph, and Professors Carl Hennigan and Tom Jefferson of University of Oxford looked at 172 studies related to this issue of social distancing. They could not find one that actually justified social distancing with COVID. And then I also quote the epidemiologist, Dr. Gerald Evans, who's the medical director of infection control at the Kingston, Ontario Health Science Center. He says, quote, to get infected with this virus, you have to be in close contact with another person, and that contact has to be for a significant amount of time. It's not 10 or 15 minutes, it's hours. It needs to be in a closed environment, a house, and in the environment there has to be a significant amount of contamination. And I quote other people in there, Dolores Cahill and others, on this very issue, the issue of masks and social distancing. and it certainly appears that we're operating under communist style control of people's movements. You can't even, you have to walk one way in the supermarket, and all this other real nonsense that healthy people, you have to be afraid of healthy people, which has never been the case. Healthy people do not put other healthy people at risk. I mean, it's conceivable, but somebody put up a meme that said, if the weather channel said there was a 99.8% chance it was going to be sunny today, but a 0.2% chance of rain, would you put on your galoshes and take an umbrella and put on a raincoat and a rain hat because of that 0.2%? No, I mean, yeah, there's maybe a slight chance that somebody who's healthy has this virus might pass it on to somebody else. But according to these other experts, it's not going to happen with passing contact. It has to be significant contact, and it should be contamination. So, but yeah, you were talking about on the ground here in Boston. I didn't actually hear about Boston College, but I did hear about Northeastern, that there were some kids that went to a party without social distancing and mask, and they got kicked out, and they were told they still had to pay their $35,000 tuition that would not be reimbursed because they
yeah, and I think there's a big lawsuit about that.
Yeah, and what happened? I mean, they didn't get sick or anything. Nothing happened. Nobody was injured by this, but they've been kicked out of school. Maybe that's good. I mean, now they won't emerge from that school with a ton of debt if they spend a full 4 years there, and with very little job prospects for college graduates right now because of the whole lockdown destroying businesses. But yeah, there's not very little in the way of science to support the mask.
No, and there's still this kind of fear, a lot of fear mongering, and it does seem to break down somewhat on political lines in that the more liberal people are, the more masked up they are, and the more conservative they are, the more they're willing to function. And of course, the old joke is that the whole thing will be over after the election if Trump loses or wins for that matter. The vaccine, you have some very interesting things in your book about that, with involving possibly a tattoo, a computer element to them, long-term health effects that are not known about them. I mean, I'm not anti-vaccine per se. I mean, I think that, we look back into the 1950s, Dr. Jonas Salk, he created a vaccine by using it on himself. And then he never took a patent on, never made a dime on it. He made it available, and it did help cure polio. So I don't think it's per se, but the question is, this particular situation has a very unique look to it in terms of how it's being developed and how it's being promoted. So talk a bit about this vaccine.
Just to back up for a moment on polio, there are a number of people in the anti-vaccine movement have noted that polio was actually on the decline. There have been some links drawn between the heavy use of spraying kids with DTT and the neurological impacts of that, and that perhaps it was not the vaccine that was touted as the cure. But getting back to the current situation, what is most worrisome, I think, in the vaccines that are being developed at warp speed, to use the White House's own language, is that companies like Inovio and Moderna are developing RNA and DNA vaccines, things that would actually change your genetic makeup. Now, if you go to a disease like sickle cell anemia, it's caused by just substitution of just one amino acid in the protein for hemoglobin. That one amino acid switch causes a person to get a deadly disease. Now, Tal Zaks, who is the chief medical officer from Moderna, has been saying that, he said this in a TED Talk, what we're actually doing, he says, is hacking the software of life. By software, he means DNA. Now, their idea is to you give the DNA instructions on how to create antibodies to fight the virus. The problem is that you don't know exactly what the long-term effects of that are going to be. They're doing no animal trials, and they've never created a successful DNA RNA vaccine before. They tried to make a SARS vaccine that failed. It never got off the ground. And so why should people who, actually according to the CDC in May 22nd, they announced a new death rate of 0.26% for COVID. And I think it's been lessened since then, based on the most recent reports. But that 99.74% chance of surviving COVID without any vaccine. So if 99.74% and others like Stanford put it even higher, the survival rate even higher, have a chance of surviving without a vaccine, why should the public be forced to take something that's highly experimental and highly unprecedented? No, never we had a DNA altering vaccine before. There are other things that can be said about the vaccine, I'm sure, but the fact that it impacts your DNA, which is very carefully designed, it's a God designed. You don't want to mess around with that. We're talking about we had transgenderism. I think that was kind of a gradual step towards transhumanism, and I'm definitely concerned that as they give this vaccine and as the virus mutates, they're going to say, well, the virus is mutated, you need another injection, you need another and another, and you keep altering your DNA until are you really human anymore? That's speculative at this point, but certainly I wouldn't want it, and I personally don't think that Bill Gates himself is going to take it. I think he wants it with his eugenics agenda. He's one of the elite. He wants the rest of us to take it, but not he himself.
And they're being pretty open about this idea of the altering of the DNA. I saw this, I think, with Lester Holt. I think they mentioned it. I mean, it's not. I think people are being conditioned to accept this as something good, and right on the surface of it, I mean, why would anybody ever want to have someone's genome altered in any way, period, ever?
Right.
Just don't,
yeah.
It's just, as you say, it's God's creation. We're created in God's image. We can't tamper with the most basic and fundamental aspects of who we are. And the idea that this would be normalized and seen as a virtue is something that's really, really troubling. And I hope people wake up to that. I'm not saying that don't ever take vaccines, but let's be informed and let's really, take a hard look at it. And also, you mentioned the element of coercion, in that there could be measures put in place to punish people who don't take a vaccine. You could end up, it could be like, after. I mean, and this is kind of a weird analogy, but after World War II. When with the American occupation of Germany, I mean, you could not get food unless you went to see a movie about the Holocaust, and then you got a little stamp which allowed you to get food. I mean, I'm not necessarily against that in that case, but the point I'm making here is that you could have the government step in and say, well, you can't get food, you can't do anything unless you get the vaccine.
Right, and actually, we see that. There's a step towards that right now where you can't get food in the sense that you can't go into many supermarkets across the United States unless you've got a mask on. Right. And so for me, it's probably a small bump up for them to say, okay, now we've got a vaccine, so you can't go to the supermarket and buy food unless you've got a certificate of immunity, which is a phrase that Dr. Fauci has used and that Bill Gates has used. And actually, they're talking about this digital tattoo, and people have seen my podcast before know I like to quote this, but when I first heard about digital tattoo, I thought maybe that's just a conspiracy theory. And then I found out that actually it comes from Rice University School of Bioengineering. So according to their website, quote, Kevin McHugh, an assistant professor of bioengineering at Rice, and a team from MIT report in a cover story in Science Translational Medicine on the development of quantum dot tags that fluoresce with information after injected as part of a vaccination. The tags are incorporated in only some of the array of sugar-based microneedles on a patch. When the needles dissolve in about 2 minutes, they deliver the vaccine and leave the pattern of tags just under the skin. Instead of ink, this highly specific medical record consists of copper-based quantum dots embedded in a biocompatible micron-scale capsule. Their infrared dye is invisible, but the pattern they leave can be read and interpreted by a customized smartphone. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came to us and said, hey, we have a real problem knowing who's vaccinated, said McHugh. End quote, Rice School of Bioengineering. So they're serious about this, about giving you a mark. And this goes right to the book of Revelation in the Bible. It
does. Mark
where they
of the
talk
beast.
about you can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. Now, if we're talking about vaccines with a quantum dot digital tattoo. Now we're talking about a case where you really couldn't buy without a mark on you. And that's about as close you get to the mark of the beast as you can. So this is very concerning to those who have a spiritual outlook.
To anybody. Now, this isn't actually happening then right now with regard to this vaccine. This is something that's being proposed or being experimented on, or how far along are they with this?
Well, they're developing it for Africa, and there is another quote I have in my book, and it regards the fact that in West Africa right now they're experimenting not only with a digital vaccine record, but it's actually it's a combination of Gavi, which is the Bill Gates Vaccine Alliance, a partnership between big pharma and government, along with MasterCard of all people, and a company called Trust Stamp, which is an AI company. And what they're doing is they're actually giving people a biometric ID, a digital ID that will include both your financial and your vaccine record. And so it looks like Africa is kind of like the prototype. It's kind of like the experimental city, like the laboratory where they do the experiments, and then which they're preparing for the rest of the world. I'm not surprised at all. Would not be surprised at all if this became normative for the whole world, a new normal.
Well, some things never change.
Yeah.
As usual, they're experimenting on black people.
Like with Planned Parenthood, you know.
Exactly, or the Tuskegee experiment. What can we do, James, as people to keep ourselves or improve our own personal health? I mean, recently Dr. Fauci mentioned in passing that he takes vitamin C and D. Now, I wonder why he took him so long to mention this. I mean, you'd think he might have said something maybe last February, you know?
Right.
But what are your recommendations as a medical person and as a researcher?
Yeah, I got to be careful here because I'm not a medical professional, and I don't want anything we say to be taken as personal medical advice, because I don't represent myself as a medical advisor. But there was a study at Northwestern University, which I quote in my book, which found a very strong correlation between vitamin D deficiency and COVID infection rates and COVID death. And so, in support of what Dr. Fauci recently said, yes, taking vitamin D would be a good idea. And of course, vitamin C has long been known to be helpful to the immune system. In addition to that, if people go outside, and then we got countries with laws against this. Now, if you go outside, you get vitamin D from the sun. That's well documented. And of course, oxygen and fresh air and exercise, building up your immune system, the things that Bill Gates never talks about. I've heard Fauci now mention it once, but I've never heard Bill Gates talk about it. No. These are things that are strongly recommended. In addition to that drug we couldn't mention before that we talked about, as well as that, and I don't know if there's a lockdown on this, but I do talk about a certain inhaler, which the Asians have been using. You know, my wife is from the country of Taiwan originally. They've only had 7 deaths as of, last time I checked was July, but only 7 deaths out of 24 million people. And there's a Dr. Richard Barnett, whom I quote in my book, said great success using an inhaler, which you give by nebulizer, and you breathe it into your lungs. And he says this is one of the reasons why the death rate is so low in Asia, and in countries like Japan and Singapore and Taiwan. Not talking about Wuhan.
Is this inhaler available in the market? I mean, what is it called?
Yeah, it's something that he prescribes, and he says he had 100% success in Texas. He's from Richard Barnett from Odessa, Texas, and I think people could probably look him up. And but that's something else he recommends that he says he had great success with. And of course, that other drug we mentioned, I do quite a number of doctors in my book have had close to 100% success. And there's also, of course, Dr. Raoul Didier in France, who had a study on over 1,000 patients with over 90% success rate with that same drug that we're not supposed to mention.
No, we can't mention, exactly, but people know what it is. And by the way, I think that my good friend, Dr. Jerome Corsi, is making it available with his partners through a company. There are some positive things that are emanating out of this whole situation. Homeschooling is on the uptick. Yeah. Even liberals, I noticed that Adam Riley from WGBH is now considering homeschooling his kids because he doesn't like the online education. I mean, yours and my dear friend, the late, great Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld,
Right.
If he was alive today, he would be probably making millions of dollars with his alpha phonics. I mean, I just wish he could have seen this. He would have. I mean, because he was one of the founders of homeschooling, and that's a positive. People are more self-sufficient. They're realizing that the government isn't going to take care of them if there's a catastrophe. So people are stocking up and are preserving and getting supplies. And it's kind of like the original idea of the self-sufficient family taking care of itself. I think that people are becoming more spiritual. They're more aware that there is a God in heaven, that we are, vulnerable individuals created in his image, and that we can't be, we're not just a bunch of pieces of cordwood that could be pushed around by the man-made state, but that we're sovereign under God. So there are some positive things that can be learned from it. There are always societal changes that come from such catastrophes, some of which are good. I think World War II resulted in more women getting into the job market and African Americans getting aware of their rights and liberties. And so I think in the case of the COVID thing, it will be more individual identity, more self-sufficiency. Maybe we'll suddenly wake up and realize that this whole rotten public school system is irrelevant. Like Sam said in his book, is public education necessary? He asked that question. So what say you?
Right. Well, the Bible does talk about the evil man falling into the snares of his own net, and I hope that happens here. I think that homeschooling is one thing that we've advocated for years that they tried to outlaw, and all of a sudden people are having to homeschool. So there are some silver linings in the blackness here, and also in terms of what people can do. There are lawsuits pending against a lot of the governors. We just had a ruling, I think it was maybe 2 days ago in Pennsylvania,
yes,
by a federal judge that said that the governor's lockdown was unconstitutional. I know there's a pending lawsuit here in Massachusetts against Governor Charlie Baker by churches and businesses, challenging the constitutionality of what he's doing. He's basing his lockdown on a 1950 law that was passed because the Soviets had exploded a nuclear weapon in 1949. And they thought that, if we got nuked by the Soviets, maybe the governor should have, more power. But that's not the situation we're in here. There was nothing about a virus. And so he's being challenged. And Gretchen Whitmer is being sued in Detroit, the lockdown queen, by medical companies because their patients are being put at risk. They're not being attended to because everything is COVID.
Right.
And there have been some successes. I know that when Governor Andy Beshear of Ohio tried to have Easter goers quarantined, that was struck down by a judge there. And now
I think Wisconsin had a lawsuit, and they threw out the lockdown in June. There hasn't been any increase in COVID in Wisconsin.
Right. And so and even Trudeau in in Canada is now being sued. So I'm hopeful that even though that they there's a lot of corruption within the judicial system, no doubt about it, and a lot of control there. It looks like they don't own every judge. So it looks like that's one thing we can do. Also, I was very impressed by the turnout of, they say, 2 million people in Germany 2 weeks ago for a protest there, as well as the stand-up protests in Britain. Ireland's been protesting. There have been protests here in the United States. I wish there were more taking place. I'd like to see them come out in the same numbers as during the Vietnam War. And really
not the kind of protests that the left is having, where they're looting black businesses and burning black neighborhoods and killing black people.
Yeah, that's a great distinction.
We're not talking about those protests.
Yeah, that's one of the very obvious distinctions between the lockdown protests are always peaceful. You don't see shootings, you don't see lootings or burnings in comparison to the Antifa and BLM. So that's something that should be a message to people about who the good guys are here. Also, just communication. I put together my book, COVID-19 and the Agendas to Come, Red Pilled, hoping that as digital information gets censored, that the book can help preserve a lot of sensitive information. And a lot of the people I quote in this book have had their YouTube videos censored. So I took, transcripts of those videos, made them or found them, and took key excerpts and put them into the book. But communication with your, not only your your U.S. senators and congressmen, but your local officials right down to the town level. In fact, in addition to this book, I had a letter published to my local newspaper, the town I live in, about what's going on, saying, hey, look, I'm on our end, and I was limited to 400 words, but I was able to quote a few scholars on whether lockdown was not necessary. So you could call, if you have a blog or vlog, that's fantastic. If you don't, you can always call a local talk show, write a letter, write to your local town officials, write a letter to the local newspaper, express your opinion. I really feel this is important at this point, Charles, because we're facing the biggest drive I've ever seen, the largest, hardest drive towards world government, and the final totalitarian state that they've been aiming for, the New World Order, that I've ever seen. And I think it's really vital that people resist it. I have full confidence based on the book of Revelation. I say in my book, the Bible doesn't end with the Antichrist, it ends with Christ. But I think God wants us to do everything we can to keep a Luciferian system from taking over this world.
Absolutely. It's our responsibility to identify that system, to expose it, to stand up against it in any way we can. And I think we should note in closing that I would suggest that one great way to do that is to make sure that you vote for Donald J. Trump for president and for Republicans for Congress. I'm not saying Trump is perfect, but he's one of the last people standing in the breach against what I would contend is this inexorable slide down the hole of a world order.
Yeah, there are people who take a view that Pastor Chuck Baldwin thinks that Trump was more successful at getting the lockdown than Hillary Clinton would have been, because there would have been a lot more resistance to Hillary
That's
Clinton.
true. That's
so
interesting.
There are different views on that, but I do agree if the Democrats got in, it would be totalitarianism, gun control. It would be a disaster. If Trump wins, there's going to be violent protests, more looting and burning. So I don't see a good outcome either way.
Yeah,
November.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, James. So listen, let my viewers again know where they could get your book and read your excellent articles.
Okay, so my book as of now is available on Amazon. COVID-19 and the Agendas to Come Red Pilled, and it actually ranked number 254 on Amazon 2 days after it was released.
Excellent.
I have to thank SGT Report for giving me a plug that really helped boost the sales, but it's staying high. The rank is staying higher than I thought it would, because I think people are very concerned about this issue, but it is available on Amazon. But I'm also doing a separate printing in case it does get censored on Amazon, so that it'll still be available. I'm working on developing secondary sellers. Right now, Power of Prophecy down in Texas has it, and I'm working on our old friends of the John Birch Society. I have some friends still there, and I'm hoping that they will make it available. They do have 3 of my other products there, and as they are concerned about constitutional rights, I'm hoping that they will make it available. But I'm working with some other potential sellers as well to make sure that this message stays out there. My website is James Perloff, PERLOFF.com.
All right, James. Pleasure as always. Thanks for joining me. I hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, Charles. We go